Hello, Internet. Once again, this is Kopitiam Council. New week, new episode as always. And today, as you can see, it's not just two of us, but let me introduce first Adi.
All right, so welcome back, everyone. I hope you all had a great return back to work after the Raya holidays. So today, as Haffiz mentioned, we don't really have the usual standard. We have a guest today. I'm very pleased to introduce you all to Mr. Avtar Singh. He is a historian who has focused and devoted a lot of energy to documenting a lot of historical events of Sabah. I have worked with him personally on several occasions, and we have great experience working with him due to his vast knowledge and a lot of the literature that he has consumed over the past few years regarding Sabahan history. So he also runs his own YouTube channel where he documents a lot of historical events that's happening in Sabah. So if you are interested in what he says for today, then you can also check out his YouTube channel, Avtar Singh History on YouTube. So without further ado, Avtar, if you want to say a few things about yourself, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you for having me, guys. Appreciate it. It's nice to be on, especially after the Raya holidays. So, yeah.
All right. So with that said, I think we can just go straight into what we're asking Avtar here today. So being a historian, Avtar, what made you get into studying history? What was it that interested you about this topic?
I think everything starts with history. I think a lot of people that I've met and talked to over the years, it's always something that triggers you when you're young. It's always something that fascinates young kids. And for me, it was World War II. And my first memories actually were in Brunei. I grew up on an island. I was born in Kota Kinabalu. I grew up on the island of Labuan. And every school holiday, my parents would send me across to Brunei because my grandparents lived in Brunei. And one of the places that they would take me every time I'd go and I'd ask them to take me there would be the Brunei Museum. And the Brunei Museum in the early 1980s was probably the most fascinating place for somebody like me. And I was always very interested in history, going to the museum. Not so much artifacts and Brunei history per se, but more to do with World War II history because they had a diorama with sound and lights on the Battle of Britain and things like that. So that really, really sort of interested me. And then there were a couple of movies that came out as a young boy. One of them, which I eventually, and this was 1982, there was a film that came out called Midway. And it had a very famous actor called Charlton Heston. And there were a couple of other very famous actors in that particular film. And the funny thing is, it took 1981 all the way to 2018 before I actually had a chance to go back and relook the entire battle from the Japanese perspective and the American perspective and try to figure out what was it all about, because it was one of those things that I was always interested in. So, yeah, it sort of started there. And I did my first history talk coincidentally in 2019 on the Battle of Midway itself. So it's picked up from there. Yeah. Oh, and school. Sorry, I have to add school as well. I went to a school where we had some wonderful history teachers. I had two teachers. A guy called Mark Eagers, this was a British history teacher. Another guy called Dr. Underwood. And they were just very inspirational as far as history was concerned. And as a young boy, I had a passion for history. So a combination of visiting the Brunei Museum and watching a movie or two and having some really inspiring history teachers that sort of showed me the way. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think the history curriculum is very different from when we were in school. It sounds better when during your time after.
Well, I went to an international school. I actually went to Singapore to study here. So I left Labuan when I was 10 and a half, almost 11. So I went to boarding school in Singapore. And so we went through a British system of education. I left primary 4 or primary 5. And when I went to Singapore, it was a completely different experience. Everything was very different. And history was very different. Everything was, we talked about World War One, the Great War, and why it was a horrible war and pointless lives lost. And these are teachers, British teachers, talking to 12 and 13-year-olds and trying to explain the Great War about it. What was horrible about it? Why was it so horrific and so forth. And we actually, I'll give you an example. We actually went out on a field outside of class during class, and they would actually show us, okay, so this is the trench line for the German side. So you guys are the Germans, you guys are the British side, and you're only this far apart. And then you've got to, they made an effort to sort of show us why it was such a horrible war. So that was just one example. But I was a bit fortunate. I went through a very different education path from most people. So, yeah.
As Mr. Avtar, since you were educated in Singapore back then,
Yeah.
do you still remember what's their perspective on Sabah or anything knowledge of Sabah?
Nothing. We did. Okay, so when you do GCSEs, we don't really look at Asian history. It's a British curricular system. So everything is British orientated, European orientated. So it's very, it's doesn't touch on Asia. It doesn't talk about colonialism. It doesn't touch on the Borneo experience. Nothing. So I actually, when I came back to Sabah 96 or 97, nobody talked about history at all. I'll give you an example. 96, 97. Nobody talked about Sabah history. Nobody had books on Sabah history. You couldn't find anything on Sabah history as an example. So you fast forward now to 2024, and we're a lot better now. You can actually get books on Sabah history. But back then, and I'm sure in the 80s was the same thing. You just couldn't find, things were very different back in the day. So.
Okay, since you mentioned back then people didn't know much about Sabah history, nor were there much literature about it. Maybe you could tell us what interesting finds you have encountered when it comes to Sabahan history.
What Sabah history?
Oh,
You don't have a history.
The history. Okay,
it's a serious question. If you're in primary school, in Malaysia, if you ask the child, so what did you learn about Sabah history? Chances are you're probably going to get a stare back, and I don't know how many chapters they've actually got in our history books at primary level or secondary level. I don't want to sound condescending. I don't want to sound negative, and I don't want to make it sound as though I am ungrateful about the education system. Our education system has its flaws, but it also has its positives as well. So, you've got to find a balance. But the point I make, what Sabah history is, we don't really have a history to tell. It's not in our school books. It's not in university. Maybe in certain classes under certain professors, you might actually touch on Sabah history. But our biggest problem at the moment is we simply don't have history to teach our youngsters. And you ask most young boys and girls in Sabah, even in secondary levels, can you tell me a bit about Sabah history? And all they probably would know is that, we were ruled by the British. They were horrible, and then they left. And, so I think it depends person to person what their perspectives are. I sometimes sit through conversations and, people ask me this question. So what is there to learn about Sabah history? It's a lot to learn about Sabah history. The good thing is it's taken time, but we actually have reached a stage where we actually are ready to produce a book to share with primary level students. We actually are ready. Okay, it's in an English format. We haven't translated it into Bahasa Malaysia yet, but we've got to that stage where it's done with sources as well. And we go all the way back. Sabah history, we can go all the way back to 400 AD. That's as far back as we can go. So, yeah.
Since you mentioned we can go as far as for that. You see, what are some underrated period in Sabah history that we can familiarize ourselves with?
Which subjects we can familiarize ourselves with?
Yeah, in regards of Sabah history. Anything that may be interesting that the public don't know about.
We have so much. Sabah history is fascinating. If I told you, I actually talked about this with Adi when I talked about the Kutai Empire in East Kalimantan, which was a Hindu empire, sort of 7th century. They didn't last very long, maybe 300 years, and then they sort of disappeared. And now we find that, okay, there is evidence in Sarawak that Sontobong was a very important, it was actually a kingdom in Santobong in Sarawak, which is, an hour's drive from Kuching. And they had a pretty large scale kingdom there. Okay, and I'll get to why it's related to Sabah. And there was an Indian kingdom, a Hindu kingdom, same like the Kutai. So the timelines are not that far off. But the reason I bring it up is timelines. Timelines are very important. For every event that happens somewhere else, there is sort of a reaction, and something happens. People migrate. People lose wars. People get kicked out of kingdom. They get invaded. They get attacked. So in this case, I believe the Yunnan kingdom. So there's a kingdom in Indochina called the Funan. We sort of confuse it sometimes. When we hear the word Funan, we think it's China. It's not. There was a kingdom in a river called Funan in Indochina, and at some point in time, that kingdom was sort of either destroyed or they were invaded. And the belief in Sarawak is that a lot of the people from there, including the royal family, moved to what is today Santobong in Sarawak. So, I mean, this is something that needs further investigation and debate. But coincidentally, then you find that the only kingdom that we know about historically, and it all comes from Chinese sources. We don't have any Malay sources. We don't have Arab sources for this, but we have Chinese sources, and they're very vague, but they give us hints. And it talks about a kingdom called Poni. It depends how you spell it. In Chinese, Poni. For us, it's maybe Poni, the way you spell it, Poni, and that's what we believe to be Brunei. But now the question is this: did Brunei rule over all the coastlines of Sabah, what modern day Sabah? And that's one of those big questions. We're not so sure. Probably yes, probably not. They may have also coincidentally been another kingdom on the west coast of Sabah from another clan or family. They migrated into the west coast of Sabah, either from China or southern China. And then you know about Sandakan as well, Ong Sumping. And that's another different kingdom in itself, along the Kinabatangan. So there's a lot of history to talk about, but we don't have a lot of information. We have bits and pieces. So you're trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle, and a lot of the pieces are missing. But you have something there to work with. That's where we are historically at the moment.
Yeah, just to add on that, because you mentioned like kingdoms, right? Would it be kingdoms in the feudal sense, or was the governance structure very unique compared to how we perceive the idea of kingdoms?
Don't know. We really don't know. All this sort of happens pre-Sriwijaya, and then it continues into the Sriwijaya period. And Sriwijaya had a proper government, and they were a telescript. I can't pronounce this word. Professor Bilchabala came out with this word. It's a kingdom that is a naval power. Basically, they rule the seas, and they are a trading outpost that trades at sea with China. And at some point in time, if you are a small kingdom, you have a bigger giant that comes along, you will end up being a vassal to that particular giant. And I suspect that's probably what happened. And the same with Brunei as well. Whether or not the Brunei that we know today is the original Brunei, before it became Islamic, it's sort of a debate. If you read a book called A History of Malaysia by the Andayans, it's a husband and wife combination that wrote this book, and it's a generally accepted book amongst most historians. When they talk about Borneo, I think they've got it right. I think the Andayans have got it right, in that it is more than likely that early Brunei was not where it is. There was an old city, an old civilization where Brunei is, Kota Batu as we call it, yes, but that may not have been the actual kingdom itself. It may actually have been, it could have been a rival, it could have been the original Brunei, either in Limbang or Lawas, because they found a lot of Hindu statues and so forth in those areas there. So it's one of those things we're not so sure about. So, yeah. it's also interesting in that Malay history for the most part generally starts with the rise of Malacca. And I would say Brunei history, in that sense, they've done the same thing. Brunei history starts when Brunei becomes Islamic. Everything starts then and moves forward. Whatever that we sort of know about before that, it's just bits and pieces and not comprehensive. So, yeah.
Another question's like back in the past, even back to Srivijaya time, whatever. Borneo Island itself, but surrounded it, there's a lot of like settlement, especially in Temasek, Singapore today, and in Java. But why particularly Borneo Island? Even Srivijaya, or they didn't go into much into the hinterland, and like you said, only in coastal area that people actually do some settlement, but barely into the heart of Borneo. Why is that?
Their strength was naval. I think their strength was naval power. And you also have to look at where Palembang is and where Sriwijaya was based. Southern Sumatra, and then you have the Riau Lingi Islands just across. You have Temasek or Singapore just nearby. And where do they get their strength from? Their strength comes from the naval force. The Orang Seletar, Orang Selat, Orang Laut. They are their warriors. And they're not... I think we have to be careful. Sriwijaya made its wealth from trade. I think we have to be clear on that. It didn't go around destroying kingdoms so much. It made its wealth from trade. And the trade wasn't necessarily limited to just Borneo. Borneo was important. We believe Brunei is an important trading post. It even predates the Brunei that we know today. It was a trading post for the longest time. They had to have been a vassal to Sriwijaya and then eventually Majapahit before they got their independence when the Majapahit sort of collapses. But I think a lot of times the Sriwijaya Empire preferred them to be vassals and to pay something or to represent them, their best interests in those particular areas. I mean, Borneo and Sumatra, they're not that near, but they're not exactly that far as well. So, yeah, that's my belief. It's a naval power. Their strength is naval power. They're not really a land force. And then the other thing also is trade. So this belief that the Orang Laut, that's a specialty, is the sea. When they are doing trade, they're doing trade with the Orang Asli. I'm talking about Malaya now, Malay Peninsula. And same with Borneo as well. Who are the Bajau along the coastline, living in villages? Who did they trade with? The natives in the interior. Natives in the interior would carry their things out to a coastal village. They may have to pay a tax. They would do their barter trade for whatever it is that they wanted. I think it was the same as well in Peninsular Malaysia. Same thing. The Orang Asli are the masters in the jungle. This is where they're from. They have their beliefs. May have been animist before the arrival of religion. And it was the same thing in Borneo as well, in Peninsula. So, and that's primarily the reason why I think they didn't go into the hinterland. They didn't go into the jungle. It just wasn't in their interest to do that. The same with if you notice as well, the same thing happens with everybody. The Bruneians don't really go in. You don't really have anything that is recorded where the Bruneians go all the way into, let's say, Tabunan to start a war, the way Mat Saleh did. If you look at Mat Saleh, how far in he went in the interior, it's quite a long ways. So, yeah.
Yeah, one thing, because I think there's a lot of focus here on the pre-Islamic history of the region here, right? I mean, I just want to know, because I assume you're part of the historical community. Is there a lot of enthusiasm to shed light into this time period, or is it something that is not really explored because of the lack of enthusiasm? Because it seems very interesting. We only know so much like the Srivijaya and the Majapahits, but we don't look into when the Malayu kingdoms were essentially a Buddhist or Hindu in character, right?
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems with... Okay, it's not a problem. I think I've got to be a bit careful here about saying that. No, it's not a problem. It's just the way... we don't have material that has been recorded going before the founding of Malacca. which is when Hinduism generally existed in the Malay Peninsula, in Temasek, in Singapore, and in Borneo. So there's really isn't. The only things that have survived are the stone tablets. Anything else, material-wise, that was written on any other material hasn't lasted, did not survive. So we only have the stone tablets to tell us little bits and pieces and stories. You look at the Kutai Kingdom tablets, which are in the Jakarta Museum. They tell us bits and pieces, little stories about Brahmin priests and so forth. But they don't tell us everything. It's just bits and pieces. Temasek was destroyed. And of course, we know that Paris Mewara, I'm not sure who, possibly escaped to little village called Malacca, and reestablishes his kingdom there, embraces Islam. So Malay history, for some reason, starts at that point in time and then goes forward. And they don't tend to touch so much on the period before Malacca. And it's just probably because there's just nothing, there's not much to go on. There's only bits and pieces that we have. They may have found some remnants, large temples in Kedah, but there is no story to tell us who built them, what happened to them, and so forth. So I think to blame academics and historians for that's a bit hard because they can only tell so much. And then the rest is just going to be make-believe and make up, making things up as you go along, which isn't, you're not supposed to really do that, are you? So, yeah. I hope I answered your question.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a mystical period, so to say. I mean, there's so much
So like I
history
said,
shrouded.
like North Borneo history.
Mhm.
How do we go back sort of the 400 AD period? It's because of Chinese writings and transcript that did survive. A lot of it was destroyed in between, but there are some that exist that talk about maybe one paragraph, two paragraphs that talk about North Borneo. And so we have some guidance that they did visit Borneo. So there was already trade pre-existing, going back such a long period of time. There was already trade ongoing. The question is, we don't know if, let's say, a village called Tuaran existed. We don't know if a village called Kudat existed. They're not listed. The only one that we seem to know that existed at that period of time is Brunei, Ponyi. Yeah, so.
All right. Let's go to what we come here for this evening. Let's go to Sabah. Can you tell us a little bit in how? Okay, you can start wherever you want in terms of the formation of Malaysia, and why do you think Sabah and Sarawak were forced into forming Malaysia?
Why have Sabah and Sarawak forced? Well, at the end of the day, the British wanted to leave. They'd had enough. So there's some. If you ask people that are into MA63, and they will tell you it's because of Stockwell's writings. Stockwell's writings, I think, don't apply to North Borneo. They are talking about India and Palestine and so forth. It's a different period of time. The Borneo question comes along much, much later because of the embarrassment in Egypt. When France and Britain invade Egypt to capture the Suez Canal, and then it's an embarrassing defeat. It's the first time the colonial powers have been defeated since the start of the Second World War in Europe. And what more is embarrassing for them, they lose face, is they lose to an Arab nation. The first time it's happened. And this actually has an effect on them because they not only anger the Americans, who they don't tell they're going to invade Egypt too. They usually do tell what they're going to do, and they don't tell the Americans. So the Americans are upset. The Russians are upset. So there's a lot of pressure on Britain to start giving up its colonies. The other thing also is going through it's going through financial difficulties at that period of time. The pound sterling had devalued. They had lost quite a fair bit of its value in the currency and investments and so forth. But the pressure was on from the United Nations to give up its colonies for the most part, and it was just a PR disaster. The Prime Minister eventually had to step down, and he was replaced. And so you get to this period of late 1950s and early 60s, and then there's the reality of communism. communism has spread. I have to be very honest. I had focused when I promised myself I wouldn't touch on Borneo history or Malaysia history. 2 years ago, somebody had asked me, you should look into MA63 and the history of North Borneo after, the formation of Malaysia. And I had told them, no, I'm not going to touch it because it's so complicated. But I eventually did by accident. And the more I look into the documents and the more I read about it, is that Sabah had no choice. No matter today, looking back, I know there's a lot of frustration and disappointment amongst many young, educated adults and even the elder generation. And they felt a lot of mistakes were made. But at that period of time, I think our leaders didn't really have a choice. What started as we will merge with the Borneo territories, with Brunei and Sarawak will form a new country, sort of evolved into we will go independent on our own, which was never going to happen. I mean, you have to be realistic. 1961, did Sabah have the financial capabilities of being able to sustain itself financially, economically? No. We have to be realistic. Could Sabah have merged with Sarawak? No. The Sarawakians were not really interested. It was something they discussed, they talked about for the longest time, but just never went anywhere. And the Bruneians had no interest. End of the day, the question that the Bruneians asked is, on what basis should we join up and form anything with you? Because we are the ones generating the wealth. What is your contribution? So for the Bruneians, it didn't make sense to merge with anybody. On top of political pressures, and they'd seen how democracy could backfire on them. You had the Azahari uprising in Brunei, and that sort of gave them a bit of a glimpse that maybe we'd better just stick with what we have, the old system. So, no, Sabah was never going to get independence. And if you were Donald Stevens, next week I'm going to be interviewing a person that knew Donald Stevens very, very well, and I'll be trying to get a bit more understanding about Donald Stevens as a person. I have some idea, but more in depth, I'll have a better idea of what went wrong at that period of time. But Donald was under a lot of pressure from the British. And I think, Donald Stevens was not a politician. He was a gentleman. He was a journalist, educated, grew up in Singapore during the Second World War. But at the end of the day, he was playing a game with more experienced politicians and lawyers, So we got what we got. And unfortunately, it hasn't turned out in some ways for us the way we expected.
Yeah. I mean, before we delve deeper into the whole can of worms here, because I think anyone listening here cannot deny how much effort and research you put into this after. Just for our benefit here, mine and Haffiz and the audience as well, what is your methodology usually? You look at a topic of interest to you, because I know you don't just do Sabah history, you also do history on the Sikh kingdoms and empires as well in India. So what usually goes through your head when you look into a particular subject? Like, what do you go for first?
Well, I have to be a bit careful as well, because the one thing I've found is that, I get a lot of people asking, can you look into this? Can you look into that? And I get sidetracked into projects that go off in a completely different path. So I try to be a bit careful nowadays. Some of the work that I'm doing now, I'm trying to finish from previous years. I've sort of discovered, maybe I should look into this. Maybe I should look into that. Maybe I need to go and speak to a group of people in Amritsar in Punjab and get a better understanding of the feudal system. How did it work? A feudal lord, and then the villagers and the village chief, how did that system work? And try to figure out, for example, where my family, which feudal lord were we under at that period of time? And how did it work? When they went to war, how did it work? So that one was a separate project to finish. So generally speaking, first, I try to get a better understanding of what actually am I getting into? What is the topic? I try to read as much material as I can. That's, all history books, for the most part, they have a narrative. Some of them tend to be very European centric. So it's the European point of view on history, which isn't always good. especially if you talk about Malaya history, a lot of the early books that are written about Malaya are written by British soldiers and British colonial administrators. But you see, they give their point of view, how everything they do is wonderful. But then that's not the case, as you discover with time. The colonialism in Malaya was not good, the way they went about treating the locals and the natives and so forth. So lots of reading of materials, trying to understand narratives and trying to find middle ground. What is the most realistic narrative that you can present that best describes what was going on at that period of time. So you try to be as honest as you can. And if you just don't know, it's better to just say, I don't know. And if you have, like I said, missing jigsaw puzzle pieces, it's better to leave them untouched rather than to create your own story and adding on to that, because that's not how it works. If you, yeah, so so I would say that's probably how I go about doing, but just lots of reading, a lot of reading. And it's very difficult to do because you get distracted, phone messages and so forth. You literally have to switch off your phone for a week or 2 weeks so you don't get disturbed. So you maybe check your messages at night. But other daytime, my phone is off and I don't really check. So just focus on reading and so forth. So yeah, it depends on the project, the size of the project, how much reading there is and so forth, and what is required, what is being asked of.
Yeah, but for you, I mean, when do you decide reading is already enough and you've already kind of have a clear idea? Because we like to think that we need to consume everything there is, all the material out there. But
what I do
for
is
you,
I try to compare what is the ongoing narrative, what actually is the general belief on a particular. So we talk about the formation of Malaysia as an example, right? For the most part, we know for the most part why the merge happened. Why did the formation of Malaysia happen? That's the general narrative we have. But if you go and read, like example, the project that we worked on last year, where we look at documents that people were not supposed to read, and now we can read them, they're available from the archives, we get a completely different story of the pressure that the various leaders were under. Tunku Abdul Rahman was scared of the spread of communism. They had just finished a war in the jungles, with the communists, the Malaysian Communist Party. And they didn't want Singapore to turn communist as well. They were worried. The PAP, the People's Action Party in Singapore, which Lee Kuan Yew led, were barely hanging on in 1961. They were actually potentially going to lose that election. And it took the Alliance Party from Malaya, that's UMNO, MCA, and MIC, to come in and politically fund that election to help them win. So that's how serious the problem was at that period of time. So once we start discovering these things, it's a lot better to understand. So that's what I do for the most part.